here in America. It's a tourist attraction, and it is obviously something that everyone wonders about. How did the Grand Canyon come to be? Was it through millions of years, or was it through the flood? And how do we know?
You know, that's a perfect showcase to understand the two competing worldviews for the past. Every visitor to the Grand Canyon is going to hear from the park signs and the park rangers that that little Colorado River, 6,000 feet below the rim, carved out that canyon over millions and millions of years, 100 million years, as it slowly removed all this sediment. And as you look down through those layers, you're looking back in time. That's what they're going to hear. Well, that is a conclusion based on a starting assumption that there has never been a world-covering flood upon this globe. The Bible goes out of its way to make it crystal clear. It spends more time talking about the worldwide flood at the time of Noah than it does the creation of the entire universe and all life on earth. That flood comes up again in various prophetic books, in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Job. It comes up in the New Testament, in the book of Peter. Jesus referred to the flood as it was in the time of Noah, so it shall be before the flood came and took them all away. So this is an important, clear teaching of the Bible for this reason. If you leave the flood out of your thinking, you're guaranteed to misinterpret everything else. You see, at the end of that flood, there was massive land movement on this earth. I mean, as you look at the earth, you just end up having to come to that conclusion. The Bible doesn't specifically talk about all this movement of land. Maybe the days of Peleg, there was a splitting of the earth, but that was probably subsequent to the main movements going on. The oceans were sinking, the water was flowing off of these newly laid down sediment layers filled with rocks and fossils and coal formations that were starting to happen. And as water channels at high speeds, even if anybody's ever seen a flooding creek bed or a flood or water rushing across the sand on a beach, it will find an area of lowest resistance and it will start to channel through that area. And then more water will, join that channel, and it will rapidly dig out enormous grooves and gouges. Not just the Grand Canyon, but we have seen canyons 600 feet deep form in a matter of hours as enormous sediment-filled flow through an area. At Mount St. Helens, 600 foot of sediment was laid down. It turned back to solid rock within months. 4 months after that eruption in 1980, there was another mud flow event, and water just broke through from area to area to area. It formed a totally new river valley cutting through solid rock in a matter of hours, 600 foot deep. The Grand Canyon, 6,000 foot deep, but the whole world was covered with water. Now, the ways we know the canyon wasn't carved by that river, there are enormous boulders that weigh 10,000, 100,000 pounds just lining the bottom of that riverbed. There have been floods where the water level has risen 20, 30, 50 feet over the last 100 years, and there is zero indication these boulders were even moved. There's no sign the river's being carved deeper, the canyon's being carved deeper by that river. There are literally cubic miles, and you can't even imagine a cubic mile of sediment that have been moved out of that canyon and flushed out into the Pacific Ocean by the Colorado River. Every other river at the end, as it flows into the river, like the Amazon River, the Nile River, the Mississippi River, you form enormous deltas as sediment is carried and the land is just deposited at the exit of the river as it dumps into the ocean. There's nothing like that at the end of the Colorado River. That sediment was flushed all the way out into the Pacific Ocean, and it's gone by the force and magnitude of that water carving out that canyon. See, these are the indications. Obviously, the river didn't carve it out. It was the flood that carved it out. The evidence is on the side of the Bible.
Now, speaking of evidence, carbon dating. This is an evidence that the researchers use all the time to date dinosaurs and rocks and all the rest of it. But there's something not quite right there, is there?
Well, first of all, carbon dating can only date something that used to be alive, that contains carbon. Rocks typically don't. When we date ancient cultures, when we date Indians, when we date dinosaurs, they will look for some amount of carbon-14. Now, carbon has an atomic weight of 12. It's stable. It doesn't deteriorate. Carbon-14 is generated in the atmosphere of the Earth. As cosmic rays from the sun hit nitrogen, it blows them apart. They recombine to form carbon-14. It's unstable. It grabs oxygen, becomes carbon-14 CO2. Plants take the CO2 to make their cells. People eat animals and plants. So you get a uniform amount of radioactive carbon-14 in everything that's alive. And it's very small. It's 1 part per trillion, but it's measurable. Now, when you die, you stop eating. That's a scientific fact. Okay. Well, that means you're not replacing this unstable carbon. And about every 5,000 years, half of it disappears. So let's just pretend, for illustration purposes, this piece of paper represents how much carbon is in your body while you're alive. Well, you die. You know, an ancient Indian dies, a mastodon, whatever you found has died. You measure how much carbon-14 is in its body. Well, when you die, there was this amount, 5,000. It's 5,270 years, but we'll just say 5,000. 5,000 years later, half of it's gone. Now you have this much. 10,000 years later, another half is gone. Now you have this much. 15,000 years later, you're down to this much. 20,000 years later, you're down to this much. Suppose a researcher finds a dinosaur, well, not a dinosaur, we'll come back to that, and some Indian grabs one of his hairs, sticks it in a mass spectrometer. He measures that Indian has that much carbon-14 left in his body. What is he going to conclude? Well, I had to divide it in half 4 times. 4 times, 5,000 each time. It must have lived 20,000 years ago. And it's presented as a fact. We have proven this Indian, this ancient civilization, this artifact was around 20,000 years ago. The Bible, if you just read it like any other book, says creation was about 6,000 years ago. This flood was in the range of 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. How could something be 20,000 years old? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. Let me ask you a question. Did that scientist just measure time? Did he just measure 20,000 years have passed?
Doesn't appear so, no.
What did he measure?
He measured the carbon-14.
He measured a chemical. All he did was measure a chemical and make an assumption. He assumed when that animal was alive, it had the same amount of carbon-14 in it that we have in our bodies today. That's an assumption that denies and ignores there's been a worldwide flood. See, before the flood, God describes this world as a paradise. If we gather up all of the coal that's on this earth, the best estimate, there's about 10 times as much vegetation on the planet before this flood as there is today. In other words, that flood buried 10 times as many trees and plants and grass and plankton as is alive today, and that stuff got packed down and turned to coal. If you just took the same amount of carbon-14 being generated, you spread it through 10 times as much vegetation, even while it was alive, it would have only had that much carbon-14 in its body. The flood happened 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years pass, you now have that much. It did during or for the first few centuries after the flood, while a new equilibrium level was happening in the atmosphere, and it just didn't have as much to begin with.
So an entire scientific basis wrong just because they deny the Bible.
They deny that there's been a flood, so they're guaranteed to come up with the wrong date.
Wow.
Nobody has a time machine. All dating methods are based on assumptions.